This is a prayer that comes to us from, it was written by Pax Christi USA for a prayer for dismantling racism, which is apropos for our entire existence of late and always, but especially given this panel discussion. We can enter the presence of the divine as we understand it. Dear God, in our efforts to dismantle racism, we understand that we struggle not merely against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. Those institutions and systems that keep racism alive by perpetuating the lie that some members of the family are inferior and others superior. Create in us a new mind and heart that will enable us to see brothers and sisters in the faces of those divided by racial categories. Give us the grace and strength to rid ourselves of racial stereotypes that oppress some of us while providing entitlement to others. Help us to create a church and nation that embraces the hopes and fears of oppressed people of color where we live, as well as those around the world. Heal your family, God, and make us one with you, in union with our brother Jesus, and empowered by the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'll pass it to Michelle to do a land acknowledgement.
Oh, Michelle, you're muted. I'm sorry. I just saw.
Thank you, Lauren. I could have gone on for a while. So in that same spirit of sacredness and recognizing this virtual space and the land that we are physically on, and the people who have been on that land, we wish to have a land acknowledgement. And I'm going to post in the chat. This is a resource that is really helpful. You can look and see on the land the native populations, the indigenous peoples who the land rightfully belongs to. So Pax Christi USA wishes to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the indigenous peoples, past and present, who have stewarded Turtle Island, a territory that includes what is currently known as the United States of America. We recognize and uplift the understanding that much of this land continues to be unceded and that many indigenous peoples nations currently lack federal recognition. To acknowledge those who have cared for the lands on which each of us dwells, you're welcome to write in the chat the name of the nation or tribe on whose land you reside. We speak and write these names in gratitude and reverence, and we commit to dismantling the legacies of racism and colonialism that continue to harm Earth and God's people.
Thanks, Michelle. And for our last part of this introduction, we thought that we could read two pieces of the Statement of Principles. And this is a document that the Pax Christi USA group we released prior to the 2020 national election. And I'm going to include a link to the larger document in the chat, but it really just speaks about where we stand on a number of issues. And so if there are two volunteers that would like to read each of these pieces, feel free to just unmute yourself if you feel called. So if somebody wants to read A Liberating Vision to start us off, that would be beautiful.
I'll read. Our commitment to follow in the footsteps and example of Jesus, born to a people suffering oppression, forced to cross borders as a refugee, devoted to supporting the struggles of marginalized peoples, persecuted, and violently killed by the ruling empire, guides our discernment of the current signs of the times, and leads us to affirm the following.
Thanks, Annie. And if somebody wants to read the section on racial justice.
I can read it. Racism penetrates every aspect of life in the United States, seeding the terror that continually threatens and kills people of color while perpetuating white supremacy and leaving all of humanity disfigured. The historical reality, readily apparent in policing, the prison system, education, and highlighted in the racial inequities heightened during the pandemic, indicts our society as one in which Black lives have not mattered. We assert that Black lives matter and that the violence inherent in systemic racism is an affront to the God who creates, redeems, and sanctifies all, and calls us together as one family. As a community of conscience, we stand together and fully support the divestment of resources away from policing and toward education, healthcare, and community investment designed to serve people. We support reparations for the suffering inflicted on Black people because of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and targeted mass incarceration.
Thank you.
And as before we get started with the actual panel, I just thought we would finish introductions by sharing a little bit about, for those who haven't participated in PKIAC before or just begun, kind of a little bit about the organization. So we're a subset of PAX Christi USA. It was born maybe inauspiciously out of an attempt to have a young adults gathering retreat planned for, I believe it was April 2020, and we can see how that turned out. And so we said, okay, that's not happening. Let's see what goes from here. And we ended up founding this group, meets in some capacity monthly on Zoom. It included, happy hours. It included discussions, study circles, a number of different events. But the ultimate goal was to give a space for peacemakers in their 20s and 30s to have a chance for empowerment and community and to kind of build leadership capacity, because I think that, I think we tend as a group to think a little differently than our elders, and we're going to be taking this movement into the future, including in that way. I think we tend to think more in terms of movements rather than organizations. And so that's kind of our beginning. It's a chance to just fellowship and gather, but also to build leadership for take PAX Christi into the next era. And I know I would say we're the future, but which all of us have heard way too often, but we're also the present. I think we're present leaders of PAX Christi as PKIAC. We're not just, but yes, ultimately the future as well. As much as we're tired of hearing that, I'm sure. Then, so we have this panel discussion to start out with our conference, which is, as Lauren mentioned, I don't know if all of you are here yet, but there's this is restricted to people in their 20s and 30s as a chance for us to kind of have a space of our own. We have our own, another panel. One of the breakout sessions is sponsored by PKIAC, which is open to everyone, which is intergenerational dialogue. But this is just a space to open up for us, and it's on policing, as we talked about racism in our country and how it permeates everything. I think there is no doubt that racism permeates policing, and the question is, can it be reformed or does it have to be abolished? And that's where we've brought three people who have expertise in this matter to our discussion today, and that will begin a discussion for us. And we can see what we think the solution is and bring that. Looking forward to a very vibrant discussion. Before I actually turn it over to the panel, I will just give a little bit of introduction. I will give read the introductions that each panelist sent, so you have a little background on them. Our first panelist is Ngozi Adu. I'm sorry, I asked Stephen beforehand, but Dule, right? I think I got the last name wrong, I'm sorry. She's a daughter of Nigerian immigrants who grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. She's an attorney, researcher, instructor whose career has focused on the intersection of racial justice and the criminal legal system. She has represented individuals sentenced to death, prisoners seeking medical care and respect for religious rights, and communities protecting voting rights. She has partnered with community organizations fighting against criminalization of immigrants, police brutality, and mass incarceration. She currently serves as the Senior Director of Research and Special Projects at the Death Penalty Information Center in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Ngozi. John Noble is the Development Director of Pax Christi USA. Before his work with Pax Christi, he worked as a digital organizer for Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, a community organizing group where he was a proud union member of CWA Local 7102. His previous work has included work with the Pastors for Texas Children, and where he organized faith leaders to support public school funding and work for gender justice and lay empowerment in the Catholic Church. John has been active in the movement to defund the police in Des Moines, and he is grateful for the Black leaders and organizers with the Des Moines Black Liberation Movement who are championing the cause to abolish DMPD and build nonviolent community-centered alternatives in policing in central Iowa and around the world. And finally, Pierre Thompson is Pax Christi Northern California's regional representative and also journeys with the PKIAC. Prior to working as a disarmament consultant, he worked in the area of community health and safety, social reconciliation, and peace education, and immigration detention. He holds a master's in peace studies from Uppsala University. Pierre will enter the Jesuit novitiate next month and credits Pax Christi peacemakers with helping him find his vocation of peace. And with that, I'm really looking forward to hearing from these remarkable panelists.
So should I start us off?
Perfect. If you want to, yeah, I think we allowed in about 5 to 7 minutes per person. If you have any opening comments that you want to share with the group. Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I started out doing a Pax Christi virtual book club, and I didn't know what I was getting into. I just got sucked in. I am also so excited to kind of talk to young people who are really thinking deeply about these issues. You heard a little bit about my background, and I actually talked with the organizers being like, okay, I'm not here official capacity. I'm just here talking about my experience and the work that I've done. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do it that way, because actually policing and executions are tied into extrajudicial executions, police killings are really actually tied into the death penalty and how the history and kind of racial injustice in the death penalty throughout the country, or throughout the country's history and the world's history. But so topically, this is something that is tied into the work that I do today at the Death Penalty Information Center. But I also just wanted to keep this as a space for me to just talk to you about where I'm at and what I'm thinking about this, because I think we all have information about what has happened in the United States forever, and what isn't working, and where we kind of see people not taking good faith efforts to change things. And I'll tell you that, like, to begin with, I don't know where I stand on the kind of like abolish versus reform spectrum side. And so I wanted just to start out with just, context. So we all know that policing in America has been tied to racial injustice, has been tied to racial oppression, has been tied to kind of implementing a caste system, enforcing a caste system based on a race, ethnicity, color, immigrant status. There are all sorts of people, like the question of like, who is other gets enforced by the way we police. And I know a lot of us have been thinking more about this this year. I know that, for me, as someone who kind of did this for work, it's about work, but it's also about life. I can, think back to growing up and having a Black family and, with the experiences that you have that are kind of fraught with, fear or anxiety that, don't need to be. So I want to take that context and we can talk about this like in history. I would recommend a couple books if folks are interested. A lot of them are the tie-in between the criminal legal system, policing, race. One is Worse Than Slavery by David Olshinsky. Another is Devil in the Grove by Gilbert King. And that one is kind of race, policing, and the death penalty as well tied in. But I think that there has always been this push and pull where the people that you had to rely on to try to keep you safe, right, were also the people that were willing to kind of use violence to set rules, or who felt free to use violence based on kind of your status. And so that's true. And the kind of racism that has been baked into the practice of policing from the get-go there. I also have on and also knowing that we've been talking about all these kind of like reform, community policing, transparency, accountability for the entire time that I've been working in whatever reform space, advocacy, policy space. And I can think about that when I was in high school, Rodney King was beat, and we were watching, the aftermath of that on TV, and there was all this talk about how things have to change. And then here we are, and then we were talking about Eric Garner and Michael Brown and Sandra Bland, and I mean, like, it's just like one after another and after another. So I see where that question about, is abolition what we have to do, as really an urgent question, especially like as long as we've been tracking the number of people who have died at the hands of police, which is not very long. So the best evidence we have is from Washington Post that has been keeping track of it. And I think they've had their database since 2015. And every year about 1,000 people are killed by police in various circumstances. We know Black people are twice as likely to be killed by police. Indigenous people are also at a much higher rate of risk of being killed by police, also Latinx as well. So we have all of this information that whatever that we say we're doing about community policing, about reforming, about community control hasn't worked. So I think that that question about like, is the very framework that we're working on broken? Can we actually see policing as something that is, in a non-violent framework, and from the peacemaking, place that you're coming from? Where does policing fit? I don't know. One thing that I would say is that I feel like the kind of international perspective on policing makes me pause, because for me, like when you think about some of what happens and what is okay in the United States and what our police are doing and that we accept as just normal, and we look at other places and we're like, actually, it's not, makes me also think about like, is this, I mean, and the answer is this deeper? Is yes, right? This, all of what is happening here is in a cultural context. But if we look at, the UK or Australia or, all sorts of places across the world that have police and have like nowhere near the rates of death at the hands of police than we do. And we can talk about like our gun culture, and we can talk about other things that are affecting it. But it also gives me the sign of like, this is not how this has to be, just as far as these effects, as far as kind of the level of violence at the hands of police. And then I think about just like the methods that we use. I remember I was at the NAACP when someone was telling me about policing in the United Kingdom and how you can't lie to suspects. And I don't know if some of you are like, police lie to suspects? I mean, for me, I was just like, wait, police, close cases and do investigations and they're not lying to suspects? What? Like this just is normal in the way that policing is approached. And me, like coming from the place where I'd been, part of community coalitions, I done know your rights stuff. So I spent a lot of time telling people like, don't, like this is the first thing you need to do. If you're ever arrested is don't talk, get your lawyer, etc. They will lie, they will da da da. But so for me, there's also something about the time that you spend being really, intentional about telling people how things are and how to protect yourself in the framework that you live in. And then to realize, wait, like it also, this framework is really messed up in some ways that we take for granted. And so I'm actually really excited about the conversations about abolition right now, because I think that there's a question about like expanding our imagination. And I think that like, regardless of whether the end result is abolition or transformation or something, the divest, invest language in the statement of principles was very common to me. I think it's interesting we're having all this debate about defund the police, but when I was doing more of this work on a daily basis, there was a lot of talking about divesting from these, making police your mental health counselors, making, police, putting all these resources into more police, when what we really needed was more social services and a better safety net and housing and all sorts of things, and things that actually build up communities. So I see things a lot in that framework about like divest and invest, and what, even if we were kind of like to bring policing down to like, what is the least that police could ever do in society. And I see things that way, but I'm not saying that like that conversation about abolition is just about having lofty ideas that might go back to police reform. Because I think I also recognize that so much of what has happened in police reform is not worked. And some of it is because just asking for the most basic things, which I spent a lot of time working with communities to try to get the most basic things. And, police unions would block it, and police leadership would kind of like, talk the talk, but never walk the walk. So some of this has just never been really tried. But I'm interested in this conversation. So that was probably way more than 5 minutes, but it's called, I'm interested in talking this out together, working this out together, hearing folks' ideas. And I have some ideas and resource areas that I'll share in chat and links and things, because a lot of people are putting energy into saying, we can't stand for this. Like, if we say Black Lives Matter, if we actually care, if we actually feel personally invested, something has to change radically. And I want to hear more about what that radical change is. And I feel like a group like this also that is willing to say, like, we have a deep commitment to nonviolence, we have a deep commitment to peacemaking, is the place to have that conversation, to have these ideas. So happy to have this chat with you today.
Thanks, Ngozi. I think you gave us a lot to think about, and I'm excited also to hear some of those different points of action and imagination that you spoke to. So I think that was a great way to kick us off. Let's see, I don't know if John or Pierre, which one of you feels called to go next, but if either of you would want to give your opening reflection for about 5 minutes, that would be perfect.
I can go next, although I believe the phrase is hard act to follow because Ngozi hit a lot of the really, really good points that I wanted to talk about too. So I want to build on a couple of those. The first of which is imagination. I think that's a really, really key point in this conversation is how much can we imagine, how much are we willing to imagine, and how much are we going to be stretched? And I want to give a little context for myself in that I grew up in a Catholic parish that was not only very white and very upper middle class, but that was attended by police officers. A cop taught my confirmation class, for context here, right? So I have always, since childhood, operated in a space where my imagination around policing was extremely limited. And I think that that's a reality for folks who share my class background, many folks who share my racial background, and my gender background as well, right? That there is a limited imagination around policing. And it goes to what Ngozi was talking about, this like long history of not having alternatives or not being given political alternatives, right? It's been through my work with racial justice movements in Des Moines and in Texas that I have come to understand more deeply what an expanded political imagination around policing can look like. And it was very much in last year's uprisings that I came to and am still coming to a deeper and wider understanding of how far that divest and invest, I always flip them. I don't know if it matters. Model can go. I was at a march this last summer where a local community activist, Indira Shoemaker, who's running for city council here in Des Moines, was talking about defunding, right? I was talking about this cross section between reform and defund and abolish. And she said something that's stuck with me since then, which is how much Black death is okay. How much? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 10? Is it 15? How far are we willing to go to fully dismantle the systems that enable death and suffering in our communities? And that's something that I've sat with since that moment and have sat with nearly every day. And it's one of the reasons that I believe we have to engage deeply in the process that Ngozi was talking about. We have to stretch our imaginations, and that ultimately we have to stretch our imaginations as Catholics to a point of abolition, to defunding the police, abolishing the police, and replacing them with something else, with moving forward with hopeful alternatives, which means housing, which means real public safety, which means mental health resources, which means healthcare in general as a human right. That's something that has stretched me. I also don't want to come across as someone who has this figured out. This is a learning process for all of us. It is a very difficult learning process. And again, it is hard to stretch that political imagination. I do want to drop a few resources in the chat. One of them is from America Magazine, from Dwayne David Paul, who has an article called "Reforms Don't Work, the Police Must Be Defunded," which seems pretty straightforward, but also goes really deeply into some of the pieces that I think are really helpful. Another resource is by Miriam Kaba, which is "We Do This Till We Free Us," which is an excellent resource that has stretched my understandings of why we need to defund and abolish the police. There's a really lovely speculative fiction piece in there that talks about what it looks like to have people be sort of nonviolent interrupters and to engage in really hard conversations. But one of the ones that I really appreciate that is also by Mariam Kaba has to do with this article, which was in Truth Out, called Police Reforms You Should Always Oppose, which I was at an organization before that was not a police abolitionist organization. Our racial justice team was working on reforms locally. But this piece and pieces like it really sparked a lot of conversation about what it looks like to do the hard work of organizing, to fight the good fight, to do that difficult work, to recognize this doesn't happen overnight, but to also have a North Star that we're moving towards, to always have a space that we're moving towards, a space of really building new alternatives. So a lot of this has to do with, are the proposed reforms allocating more money to the police? Are they technology focused? Are they focused on individual dialogues with individual cops? Do they focus on this euphemism of community policing, which often pumps more resources into the cops and more cops into neighborhoods? And unfortunately, the framework that we're seeing, which is very much a bipartisan framework and has very much been championed by people like President Joe Biden since the crime bill, has to do with this very, very clear model of reform that is reforming the system, but I would argue is reforming it in a way that's making it significantly more dangerous, that doesn't give us this North Star. And most importantly for me, something I've learned from local activists is, does this take power away from policing and does it give it back to the people? Which has been a central question for me. Does it take power away from the police and does it give power to the people? And if the answer is no, that's where we should have alarm bells about certain quote unquote reforms. Again, this is something that I'm learning. This is something that has challenged me. This is something that I find myself sitting in a space of discomfort with and being stretched far outside of my comfort zone with everything that I've participated in the last few years, especially within the last year. But I do think, and I've blown past my time too, but I think in closing, I think if anyone is going to do this stretching and this imagining, I think it can be Catholic peace activists. And the reason that I think that is because these are the people, Catholic workers, Catholic peace leaders, these are the people who taught me to stretch my political imaginations about a lot of things. These are the people who taught me to say no nukes instead of less nukes. These are the people who taught me that we can envision a world where we don't have militaries, not where militaries do things differently, but where peace is at the center of everything we do. So it's Catholic peace folks who taught me that there's a nonviolent alternative to every system of violence and every system of destruction and domination in our world. And I know that logic can also be applied to things like policing and to prisons. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And lastly, I know the other tie-in of this, part of it was looking at police reform and abolition, but especially the militarization of police. And I know Pierre has some of that to touch on specifically in light of lethal autonomous weapons. So I'm going to invite Pierre for a few minutes to share your opening reflection as well.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Lauren. It's good to be here. And, I'm really glad that Pax Christi USA is looking at militarism really at the most local context, because I think if we're not able to address violence in our communities, it's really hard to say that we're going to make an impact on the militarization of US foreign policy. So today I want to share some reflections on the militarization of artificial intelligence and robotics. We're beginning to see police departments adopt predictive technologies and AI systems that have been designed by tech companies, universities, and the military. All of these are institutions with their own deep-seated biases. And while some might say that autonomous technology is going to make policing more accountable and more cost-effective, I think it's actually going to change policing in some pretty significant ways for the worse, by further dehumanizing the victims of police brutality, and by diluting and even eliminating human responsibility for police misconduct. I want to emphasize that I think this is a critically important time for young people like us to be doing everything that we can to resist the development of new forms of military technology, because it's only going to be harder to regulate once these technologies are widespread and in our communities. And if you're like me, you probably know many other young people who are actively working on developing AI systems that are directly or indirectly tied to violence. I want to start by kind of grounding my remarks in the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which I think was shaped as much by the killing of George Floyd as it was by the COVID-19 pandemic. And Pope Francis has this vision of human fraternity that, quite frankly, is not consistent with finding scapegoats, eliminating enemies, and justifying the use of force. In fact, Pope Francis warns us that when a society is willing to leave a part of itself on the fringes, no amount of resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance systems can indefinitely guarantee tranquility. There's a beautiful section of the encyclical that deals with the inadmissibility of the death penalty. And I just want to read a small part of it, because it really is also a critique of the criminal justice system, even though Augustine, who Pope Francis quotes extensively, was living 1500 years ago. And he says, our desire is that justice be satisfied without the taking of the lives of murderers or the maiming of their bodies in any part. When violence is restrained and remedies meant to produce repentance are provided, it should be considered a benefit. And Ngazi also pointed out that Pope Francis views the death penalty as also encompassing extrajudicial or extra-legal executions, often passed off as clashes with criminals, end quote. So this brings us to the current problem, I think, with police reform. I think it's good that we're beginning to imagine alternatives, and people are talking about how much less money police departments actually could receive. But I think one of the pitfalls here is that there might be more interest in the deployment of technologies that either assist or completely replace the role of human beings and human judgment in policing. And we really can't expect technology to solve our underlying social problems. In this case, I think it's racism. Because the technology itself, as Pope Francis has written, is often shaped and directed by powerful interest. And it's used to enforce systems of social control. And so we need to understand that artificial intelligence is not God. It's actually designed by human beings, and it's designed mostly by white men who train algorithms to make decisions using large data sets that are racially biased or unreliable. AI is considered to be about 100 times worse at accurately identifying the faces of Black or brown people compared to white male faces. And I just want to give some examples of how law enforcement agencies have already been or are beginning to deploy really a wide range of AI and surveillance systems at every stage of policing and the legal system. So there's things like predictive policing that in effect sends police to low income and Black neighborhoods where crime is predicted to occur because of previous data. There's facial recognition technology that covers at least half of the US population if you're on social media or you have a driver's license. And the linkage between facial recognition and really prevalent surveillance data, which allows police to falsely accuse people of crimes that actually they may not have committed. But if the system says that your face looks like the face that they saw in the video, that's how some people get in trouble. Autonomous decision-making is already used in some cases to inform bail and sentencing decisions if the computer algorithm thinks that you're more likely to reoffend. And in the extreme, really the development of autonomous weapon systems that are using sensor processing, not human beings, to select and engage targets autonomously because they happen to match some pre-programmed profile. And a lot of this technology really was developed over the course of the past 2 decades that we've been doing drone warfare, which has been at least remotely piloted in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen. But we're really on the threshold of seeing this technology become fully autonomous. I want to emphasize the importance, I think, whether it's in warfare or in policing, of preserving a face-to-face encounter. And I say this because I think the reason that the George Floyd killing sparked so much moral outrage last year was because in the end, it was an encounter between 2 human beings whose faces were inches apart, one face crying out, "I can't breathe," and the other face basically saying, "I don't care." And we have to be aware that the more that we rely on algorithms and robots, the more that we are putting these decisions about life and death into entities that don't see faces and don't recognize the value of human life. They only see pixels and recognize patterns. And robots also don't have faces. So there's no possibility of having a meaningful encounter with a police robot, and there's no way to hold it accountable. And I hope that over the next, several minutes that we have for discussion, that we're really able to think about different ways of acting. I just want to kind of outline 3 different levels that I see that I think can be further explored. The first would be at the level of the companies that are making these AI systems, just making sure that we're giving a framework for the development of ethical algorithms. There's something called the Rome Call for AI Ethics that the Pontifical Academy for Life has put out. And it's really a good guideline that Catholic engineers, I think, should be aware of. And companies are starting to commit themselves to this vision. At the national level in the United States, we really need to be considering legislation to place a moratorium on unregulated facial recognition and biometric surveillance. And at the global level, as I said, before this technology really reaches a mature state, we really need to think about a legally binding instrument or a ban on lethal autonomous weapons. And there are many organizations that are committed to accomplishing this. So look forward to the conversation with you guys.
Thank you, Pierre, and thanks to all the panelists for giving us such strong, ideas and questions to grapple with as we continue on this evening. So I think to explain kind of the flow of the rest of this event, and especially the next thing that we're going to move into, I will pass it over to Bob.
Hey, everyone. My name is Bob. I'm one of the co-facilitators of PKayak. What we're going to do right now is we're going to go into breakout rooms of 3 or 4 people. And the goal is to discuss some of what we've just heard from our great panelists, but the real goal is to come out with a question for them. So reflecting back on what has been said, taking it into your own lives, sharing with one another in small groups, and then have a question to pose to the panelists. What I want to do is I want to pitch my own question to the panelists to get us going. So all 3 of you talked about imagination and in different ways. And I think that the Catholic imagination is one of the reasons that despite all of its flaws, I remain Catholic and in the church. That sort of sacramental sense of the world, the ability to imagine something new and different and resurrected. So I'm wondering if you can talk specifically either about what is being imagined, like what is the other side look like? And I think that's a hard question, so don't feel like you have to have an answer. Or what specific parts of the Catholic tradition and Catholic imagining need to be tools for us in the process of abolition, like both for ourselves internally, but what else can we offer the wider either faith or secular communities?
I love that question, and I like that framing of that kind of Catholic imagination and what keeps you here. I have my fraught relationship with a lot of things around Catholicism, but there is something about that kind of basis in Catholic social teaching that I do think that this question about kind of rooting the possible in the sacred, you know, and in an understanding of our humanity and our calling and the possibility that is beyond what should be possible, that's beyond what seems reasonable, what seems attainable, that there's just something there. So I don't know if that's a uniquely Catholic perspective, but I do think that there's something really rich in this ability to kind of I guess to turn on the head what would be seen as conventional knowledge of, well, of course you can, or of course you can't, or of course you should, to say, well, we're looking at this from a different framework, which is not just about what has always been done, but kind of what are we called to do, and what are we called to do from our real view of the teachings of Jesus, and what are we called, and we have, I think that's a thing that I think that I take with me knowingly and unknowingly, is that we have this like really rich and deep framework of Catholic social teaching, which does not really go with business as usual mindset, right? It does not actually, like, if we were actually thinking about those principles and thinking about a preferential option for the poor and living our lives in that way, we wouldn't be just doing business as usual. So I guess for me, I think that's something that I bring, whether I'm acknowledging it every day or not. So.
Yeah, I guess I can continue on that. So I agree, this is a really good question. And I really like the term imagination. I think it's similar in a way to the term of dreaming, which Pope Francis strongly endorses, because dreams can be made into reality. I think in terms of how we're approaching the issue of policing, I think we want to not conflate imagining with fantasy, and I think the problem with like allowing technologies, say, to mediate interactions between human beings, is that people actually lose that sense that this other person that is being encountered, even if it's in kind of a police civilian relationship or context, at the end of the day, those are two human beings. Those are two people made in the image and likeness of God, and that is something to behold. And like I think the problem with letting computers and perspective that this is a human being whose dignity and worth is just infinite, and so the dehumanization that comes from that, which allows for the violence, and allows for the brutality to take root.
I really appreciate that distinction between dream and fantasy, or imagination and fantasy, because I think what it doesn't cut us off from is this hope of radical possibility. What I've found in the writings of liberation theologians, in the writings of, say, Pope Francis or John the 23rd, is this sort of unparalleled and unbelievable sense of possibility. So the first time I ever read Pacem in Terris, John the 23rd doesn't talk about like tinkering around the edges and maybe we could get a few less nukes out of this thing, crew, right? No. It's like there is peace. There is peace the world over. And that's the goal that's set out. I think there's a lot in the Jesus narrative, right? We believe in a God that not only overcame death, but that crushed it into the dirt, right? Literally flipped it on its head, right? So if we can believe in those things, if we can lay out a narrative of radical possibility for peace and radical possibility and resurrection and the defeat of death, then I don't know why we can't imagine a world where no one has to do the job of policing and no one has to be in a prison, right? I think that there's a lot of hope to be found in that. I'm probably overstating the amount of hope that I feel on a daily basis about these issues and others, but I hope that it is inspiring in some way. So,
great, thanks. If you have questions, you can just unmute and ask a question, or if you want to write to Lauren or myself and you want to submit something anonymously, feel free to do that. But I'll open it up to whomever has questions. You have had a chance to prepare, so, you know, impress us. I'm just kidding. I'm just John's face. Anyway, floor is open.
I can ask a question that Brian and I were discussing. In terms of the other possibilities that we're imagining going forward, and if we're coming from a place of restorative justice where we're concerned about the victims of violence, but also the perpetrators, and moving toward a place where we're repairing the divisions, how do we, John, you mentioned the police officer that was in your parish. I mean, there are police officers in our parishes, in our church. And so how do we imagine a future that doesn't have policing as we know it, but that somehow there is a place for those officers who, you know, maybe went into policing because they're drawn to power, but maybe had some good motivations for going into this line of work. And I mean, even if we abolish policing, the system as it is, we can't abolish the officers, the people. So where is the place for them in the futures that we're imagining?
I think this is a really good question. And, you know, in my family, I have people who have worked in law enforcement, and, you know, it's served them well financially and professionally. And I think, you know, the problem of what to do with the police officers, you know, if you're defunding them or even abolishing the police departments, is actually very similar to the problem of disarmament, because there are many people whose livelihoods and sense of vocation is tied to these industries that we would consider to be immoral. And I don't know if I have a good answer to that, but I think it's probably closely related to the idea of reimagining. And I think maybe kind of shifting the sense of, you know, policing as providing security to a sense of helping people to to bring to be in conditions where they are safe. And it's a very kind of subtle shift, but I think, you know, there are ways that, that police officers and their kind of unique skill sets could probably be productively channeled into similar pursuits.
I think, oh, go ahead and go.
Go ahead, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of the work around a green transition has helped me understand some of this. That at the heart of things like the Green New Deal has been finding regenerative work, regenerative agriculture, new jobs for folks who depend on things like the fossil fuel industry, right? I think we can learn a lot from those spaces. One of the most challenging things that I've experienced, but that I think is an important challenge, has been at marches here locally. Oftentimes, one of the things we will chant, or that leaders at the movement will chant, is calling on the police officers to walk off the line, to quit their job, to come and leave policing behind, and to do something different. And that was a challenge for me the first time I heard it, but I have really come to understand that as a prophetic call, and more than that, as a compassionate call, right? That if I'm doing something, and I think it's a call I also have to be open to. I'm not trying to exempt myself here or say that I'm free of oppressive behaviors, but I think it's a call we all have to be willing to offer to our neighbors, to say, you are doing harm to the community, or you are doing harm to me, and I need you to walk away from it. But it is going to involve things like what the green transition is trying to do, of trying to, you know, re-educate and return people to regenerative and hopeful and peacemaking work, which I don't want to pretend is going to be easy or happen quickly in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think we can think about a lot of ways where this is about just a society that reflects the priorities that we say that we hold, and going back to the, you know, Catholic priorities of like human dignity and respecting human dignity. And I think about the fact that the correctional system in any state that you go to is actually going to be your biggest mental health provider, right? So if you think about that, and you think about how ill-suited jails and prisons are for mental health treatment, and the ways that we have or would not be willing to funnel the amount of money that is funneled into jails and prisons into just straight up, you know, mental health support and treatment. I also think about the ways that there are so many, in conversations with police, they say, well, we're not social workers, we're not counselors, but we're being called to be. And that's sometimes one of the complaints is like, you're asking too much of us to be everything for everybody. But it's like, well, what if we took some of that everything out of this, right? Like, so maybe if you've been spending a lot of time going into, you know, domestic violence situations, and you have been there, we're talking about units that are kind of formed around responses for this. So some of the things that have been the result of efforts like Violence Against Women's Act and things like that have created more trauma-informed responses to domestic violence. I'm like, wouldn't it be interesting if like you were a counselor on, you know, domestic violence, or, you know, got trained in family therapy or something, you know? I think that there are ways that we can think about the things that really shouldn't be in the criminal legal system, and thinking about ways to actually make those supports, and thinking about tools that maybe we shouldn't be expecting people who don't have the training and have kind of a focus on arresting people, but end up being in these situations where there's like the necessity for mediation, necessity to understand juvenile brain development. Like, what about if there are places that were working proactively on that, and that we're actually doing the work and retraining? Another place that this has come up is in prison towns, right? So you have entire towns where everybody has a family member who works at a prison, or multiple family members that work at prisons. And the question is, has been asked, it's like, you know, especially when there's pushback on like closing prisons, it's like, well, so is that what you see your town's identity is, as the state's jailer, the state's imprisoner? And are there ways that we can actually look at our identity and look at what we want and are looking at for our lives that are not about centered around mass incarceration? And so I think that is part of the imagination. I think that that question about what aren't we investing in as a society? What aren't we building up as a society that makes it less likely to have the situations that require police intervention, that have resulted in incarceration, that have resulted in arrest, helps us point us in directions of places that maybe we should be actually looking for folks and seeing folks who might, you know, now be employed in prisons, now be employed in police departments that might actually build skills that are kind of working on peacemaking and peace building. So
I think in my local context, we see that a lot in rural communities, both in the Midwest and in the South, where in Ngozi, when you were talking about prison towns, it's a real thing. And it's because a lot of these communities have not been given alternatives. Oftentimes corporate agriculture has come in and removed folks from, you know, the farming that they were doing. This happens a lot in indigenous communities, right? We see a lot of the difficulties that have gone on because people are not given alternatives. So it's very much this defund, refund, divest, invest. We have to think about what we're building for people beyond a prison town or beyond, you know, going to work in this. And we see it here locally. There was a prison situation where I don't know if it was two, but a few prison guards were killed here in Iowa. And what happened were killed by prisoners. And the response that we had from local elected Democrats was, well, we need to give more money to prisons, right? We need to pump more money into staffing these prisons. We need to make sure that prisons are adequately staffed. That's putting more money into systems of incarceration, right? So the question was not, how can we have less people in prisons who are experiencing this violence? The question was, how can we put more money and more taxpayer resources into prisons, right? So I think that cuts into it a lot as well.
Great. The discussion makes me think of John Sobrino's point that, and I don't want to dismiss the materialist concerns here that you've all raised, but that salvation for oppressors is the stripping away of their oppressive power. So I'm glad to hear you all, like, we're concerned about the police and prison guards too. Is there maybe one or two more questions? We're coming up on our time. I know there was one in the chat. Someone had messaged me. I don't know if they want to ask it. Or if not. Okay, so.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead and ask our question, Bob. Thanks. So our small group was Maria Dell, Lupe, and myself. And our question was really prompted by Ngozi's comparison of the expectations around norms in the US and the UK, namely that it's acceptable for US police officers to lie to suspects, and in the UK that's not. And so we were curious, and this might be outside the realm of the panelists where you were prepared to give to our session, but we were wondering, were there examples of countries that our panelists look to as exemplary in reforming or abolishing police forces? And if so, how did those countries also view incarceration?
I will start just because I started this. I don't know if I have a specific country. So I'll send a link to show just like the ridiculous, like we're like off the charts on police violence, and they're just a sampling of other countries that are like, you know, like we're here and they're like down here as far as the number of people who are being killed by police. I don't know if I would say that I have a goal country on this. One thing I think that is always going to be true is that if you have some type of like racial inequality, social inequality, the way that your laws are enforced are going to reflect that. So when I talk about the UK not lying to folks and also not killing as many folks, there's still like racism and all sorts of kind of religious discrimination that is happening in their policing. I think that there are countries like, and maybe I don't know why I know so much about UK policing, but I think that they had to do some reforms based on kind of internal work. So I think that you could probably find places that have done some like deeper work and have had some deeper culture change around that. Oh, thank you. Is that the link for the I think it's important, and I think Caucus Christi is a group that has a global view, and I think it's important to have that because it really is so easy to say like, oh, this is just how it has to be, without having like, oh, not everywhere. I will also mention that, like, sadly, but in a good thing, that Illinois just passed a law now that you can't lie to juveniles, so you can't lie to people under 18. Police can't lie to. So I was just like, this is a good example for me. Like, clearly that's a big deal, right? It's a huge deal because if we talk about false confessions and wrongful convictions and all this kind of stuff, police lying and getting people to confess to stuff it's a big part of that, right? Like, there are all sorts of like, you know, effects of that, but I'm just like, the fact that we're celebrating that in like one state you can't lie, not you can't lie to anybody that is under investigation, you just can't lie to kids. This is kind of a demonstration of the pace at which police reform has happened and, you know, or not happened in the US. But that's like my bat. I mean, it's so great. Like, good job, Illinois. Illinois has done a lot of reform work this past year. And it's also one of the things that I probably would not have been possible a year ago, because of George Floyd's death, because of all the outrage, that there's a lot that has passed that people have been trying to get past for like ever, and that has now happened. But that's a side note. I don't know if anyone else has like a model country.
Yeah, I don't have a model country, but you know, I just wanted to say that I think in the United States, you know, the history of policing is so closely linked to the institution of slavery and slave patrols, right? And so that is kind of the original sin that we have to wrestle with here, and the quality that you have in society, the easier it is for policing to you know, to brutalize people. One of the things that fascinated me last year watching the Black Lives Matter protests around the world was actually the extent to which people in every country, it seemed, had legitimate grievances against the police, even if statistically their numbers were not nearly as bad as the United States. I think, again, that sense that there are unequal groups in society and that system of policing kind of reinforces that, that seems to be actually pretty universal.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that is really amazing to me and interesting to me has to do with the fact that an internationalist vision more broadly, whether or not you're dealing with a specific country or something like that, that internationalist vision really pulls the wool off our eyes about it has to be this way. Like what Ngozi was saying, whether it's war, whether it's the death penalty, whether it's the police, it has to be this way is gone, which is, I think, very hopeful.
I would also say that if you look at some of the kind of community resource hub resources, like I think sometimes people have been, when they're looking for models, they haven't necessarily been looking at countries, but they've been looking at things that from like indigenous communities. They've been looking at things like from just like smaller groups. Like there's something about changing the way that we interact with each other, the way that we are invested in each other, and the way that we kind of hold ourselves accountable and deal with harm. And someone talked about restorative justice and that being a part of it. So I definitely think that people are looking for models, not just in kind of what we are doing across the world, because frankly, also like we export some of what, you know, is being done across the world, right? Like there's like a model of policing that I don't know, like isn't there a movie right now about this guy who's one of the founders of modern day policing, Arsène Lupin, who was actually kind of a shady guy, but like there are ways that like models of policing, especially in kind of the wealthy countries, gets exported to. We can see it in how many people like we train and send off in other countries too. So I think that a lot of people are also kind of looking backwards further and looking smaller about, you know, different ways to even think about and thinking about it not in a policing way, just a community safety, a community trust, a kind of way. So.
Well, thank you to Ngozi and Pierre and John. I have the curse as moderator to have to cull our discussion here, but it's certainly given me a lot to think about and pushed me a little bit. And I'm sure this won't be the last time that PKIAC takes up questions of policing and militarism and mass incarceration and racism and all of the related issues, intersecting issues.